My aunt held me down while they pressed the heated iron against my chest to keep the boys away. When I asked if she ever regretted it, she laughed bitterly and said, "Regret is a luxury for women who raised daughters wrong." I stayed silent. That was 5 months ago. Yesterday, she saw my face on the local news, and the iron clattered from her hand mid-sentence. In my family, every girl who started developing had to go through what they called the pressing. It didn't matter if you were 11, 12, or 13. The moment your body showed any sign of changing meant you were ready for the hot iron sizzling against your skin. Growing up in our small community outside Atlanta, I thought it was something all girls experienced, like getting your period or wearing a training bra, until I turned 12, because that's when I watched my cousin Keisha scream for 4 hours straight as they pressed the heated clothing iron wrapped in fabric against her chest. They heated it on the stove first until the metal glowed orange, then wrapped it in a thin towel that did absolutely nothing to stop the burning. My aunt held her down while my grandmother did the pressing, saying it was for her protection, to keep the teenage boys away, to let her focus on her education, to save her from getting pregnant too young, like so many girls in our neighborhood did. But even at 12, I could see the tears streaming down my aunt's face as she pinned her own daughter to the bed. The other girls in our apartment complex whispered about it late at night, when adults couldn't hear. Some said if you bound yourself tight enough with ace bandages, your chest would stay flat longer, and maybe they'd forget about you. Others said sleeping on your stomach helped delay it, but we all knew eventually our turn would come around. My best friend Shanice had already been through it 3 times because hers kept developing back. Her mother said she had stubborn genes, even in her body structure. I started wearing my older brother's oversized hoodies, 4 sizes too big, wrapping myself with compression wraps I bought at the drugstore with my allowance money. Anything to hide what was happening to my body as it changed. I slouched my shoulders forward constantly when I walked anywhere, avoided gym class and running, stopped playing basketball with the neighborhood kids because movement made everything obvious. Every single morning when I woke up, I checked in the bathroom mirror, praying nothing had changed overnight. But bodies don't listen to desperate prayers. By 13, it was getting impossible to hide what nature intended. My aunt started watching me differently, studying me with calculating eyes during family dinners. One morning in early September, she grabbed my arm while I was doing dishes after breakfast. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said quietly, "we'll take care of you before it gets any worse, before the boys in the neighborhood start noticing and sniffing around." That night, I couldn't sleep even a little bit, tossing and turning until dawn. The next morning, I pretended to be violently sick, claiming stomach flu, doubling over dramatically, moaning about pain. But my aunt wasn't fooled by my act. She'd seen every trick in the book, she said, heating the iron on the stove while my mother looked away toward the window. I tried to run out the apartment door, but where could a 13-year-old girl go in a housing complex where everyone knew everyone's business? The first press is something burned into your memory forever. The smell of burning skin mixed with the aloe vera gel they used. The sound that came from deep in your throat that you didn't know a human could make. The way your vision goes completely white, then pitch black, then white again, as your brain tries to protect you from the overwhelming pain. They did one side methodically, then moved to the other side, working systematically, like they were ironing wrinkled clothes that needed to be perfectly flat. My mother held my wrists down tight, whispering that I was being so brave, that it would be over soon, that someday when I was older, I'd understand why this was necessary for my protection. For 3 long weeks afterward, I couldn't lift my arms above my shoulders, couldn't lie on my stomach or back without excruciating pain, could barely take a deep breath without feeling like my chest was on fire. The burns wept clear fluid constantly that stuck to my shirts and bras. My aunt applied antibiotic ointment and aloe vera twice daily, checking carefully for any signs of infection, actually proud of the work she'd done to protect me. "See," she said to my mother with satisfaction, "flat as a board now. She'll be safe from those teenage boys and their intentions." But 4 months later, my body started developing again naturally, like my body was fighting back stubbornly, refusing to be permanently suppressed by their traditions. My aunt was absolutely furious about it. Said I was eating too many hormones in chicken, drinking too much milk, purposely inviting trouble with my diet. She scheduled another session, this time planning to use the cast iron skillet, heated until it practically glowed red. The second time was infinitely worse because I knew exactly what was coming, could anticipate every second of the agony. That's when I met Mrs. Thompson, the new health teacher, who just started at Lincoln Middle School. She was from Boston originally and wore professional pantsuits and had studied public health at a university up north. During a comprehensive lesson about puberty and bodily changes, she mentioned something that made my heart stop beating for a moment. In some cultures and communities, she said carefully, people hurt girls' developing bodies to try to control them, but your body belongs to you and only you, and no one has the right to harm it. After class ended, I hung back nervously while other students filed out. "Do you know about the pressing?" I whispered urgently, looking around to make sure no one could overhear us. She looked at me intently for a long moment, reading something in my face, then gently closed the classroom door for privacy. "Sit down," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside me. "Tell me absolutely everything that's happened." I told her about the heated iron, the burns, the unbearable pain, my aunt's misguided pride, my mother's conflicted tears, how it was happening to every girl I knew in our community, how some had been pressed 6, 7, 8 times until their chests were covered in permanent scars and damaged tissue. She pulled out her phone and showed me articles from medical journals, terms I'd never encountered before, like child abuse, physical trauma, tissue necrosis, infection risk, psychological damage. She showed me photographs of adult women whose breasts never developed properly because of repeated pressing during adolescence, women who couldn't breastfeed their babies later, women with cysts and tumors and chronic pain. She explained that in most of the country, this was considered illegal child abuse, that organizations were fighting against these practices. "But this is tradition in our community," I protested weakly. "This is how they protect us from getting in trouble." "Protection from what exactly?" she asked pointedly. "Protection that requires torturing children isn't protection at all. It's just cruelty disguised as caring, wrapped up in fear and control." She gave me pamphlets to hide in my backpack, printed information about Georgia state laws protecting minors, phone numbers for child protective services, and organizations that specifically helped girls in situations like mine. She said firmly, "Change always starts with understanding, with education, with one brave girl telling another, who tells another, who finally speaks up." The very next morning, as my aunt was heating the cast iron skillet on the stove for round 2, a car pulled up outside our apartment complex. Social workers with official badges and paperwork, with legal authority backing them up. My aunt tried desperately to resist their presence, but they knew the laws inside and out, knew exactly what rights they had. They examined my healing burns carefully, documented every scar with photographs and measurements, took my detailed statement about what had happened. And that's the moment when everything in my world changed completely. Not just for me personally, but for our entire apartment community and everyone who lived there. The social workers moved through our building like they owned the place, their official badges gleaming under the fluorescent hallway lights. Ms. Rodriguez, the one in charge, had me sit on our worn couch while a woman with latex gloves started taking photographs of my chest from multiple angles. Click, click, click went her professional camera, while my aunt stood in the kitchen doorway screaming that they were government devils sent to destroy our community traditions, that educated people from up north didn't understand how to protect young girls in our neighborhood, that we'd all end up pregnant before 16, without the pressing to keep us safe. My mother just stood there frozen between us, her entire body trembling as she tried to read the legal documents Ms. Rodriguez handed her, trying to understand the official language while the papers shook in her hands. The photographer measured each burn scar precisely with a medical ruler, writing detailed notes in her official notebook, asking me to turn different directions under the bright light she'd set up. Ms. Rodriguez explained carefully that they needed to check the other girls in the building too, that this situation was much bigger than just my individual case. But when her team started walking toward the other apartments, mothers frantically grabbed their daughters and pulled them inside quickly, apartment doors slamming one after another, like dominoes falling in sequence. Only Shanice stayed visible, standing behind her mother in the doorway, her hand pressed protectively against her own chest, where I knew her scars were hidden under her t-shirt. Her eyes met mine across the courtyard, and I watched her fingers trace the raised scar lines through the fabric, remembering her own trauma. Mrs. Thompson appeared at my side then, car keys jingling in her hand, saying we needed to go to Children's Healthcare immediately for proper medical treatment. That serious infection could develop if we didn't clean and treat the burns correctly with proper antibiotics. I climbed into her Honda, a clean car that smelled like vanilla air freshener and leather seats, so completely different from the city bus I usually took everywhere. Through the back window, I watched our apartment complex get smaller and smaller in the distance. My aunt still shouting from the doorway, my mother standing paralyzed with those legal papers trembling in her hands, neighbors whispering urgently behind their hands about what was happening. The hospital was bigger than any building I'd ever been inside, all gleaming white tiles and fluorescent lights so bright they hurt my eyes after the dim apartment. The nurse there was incredibly gentle, her fingers soft and careful as she examined each burn scar, measuring how wide, how deep, how old each one was while she documented everything in her computer. I counted on my fingers for her when she asked about timing. First time 5 months ago when Aunt used the clothing iron. Second time 3 weeks ago with the heated cast iron skillet. She took even more photographs from different angles, close-up shots that showed every detail of the scarring, explaining these would serve as evidence for the official case file they were building. The medical antiseptic she carefully applied stung worse than anything, but she explained it would prevent dangerous infection, that some girls came to the ER with burns that wouldn't heal properly for months and required skin grafts. I sat in the waiting room afterward on those uncomfortable plastic chairs. When my mother appeared 30 minutes later carrying my school backpack and extra clothes hastily stuffed in a duffel bag, she wouldn't make eye contact with me, just stared at the white tile floor while she whispered that the social workers said I might need to stay somewhere safe for several days. I understood immediately what she meant without her having to spell it out. Away from Aunt, away from the apartment complex, away from the heated irons waiting in our kitchen. The social worker, a woman with reading glasses and a genuinely kind smile, sat us down in a small private office and explained that I'd be staying with Mrs. Thompson temporarily while they conducted their investigation, that my aunt legally couldn't be alone with me until the case review was completed. My mother nodded silently, but I could see her mind working overtime, trying to figure out how she'd explain this to the extended family, to the neighbors, to my aunt, who basically ruled our building like a queen. That night, I lay in Mrs. Thompson's spare bedroom on an actual bed with a real mattress, staring at her walls covered with framed degrees and posters of successful women doctors, women pilots, women judges in black robes. She brought me hot chocolate in a blue ceramic mug, something I'd only seen in movies and TV shows, and the sweetness made my taste buds tingle. Everything felt strange and new and completely impossible, like I'd stepped through a doorway into someone else's completely different life. The next morning, I woke up to find my school uniform hanging on the closet door, washed and pressed with sharp creases. Mrs. Thompson set breakfast on the kitchen table, toast with strawberry jam instead of the usual instant oatmeal, and said firmly that I absolutely wasn't missing school because of this situation, that my education mattered more than anything people might say about what happened. But my stomach churned anxiously, thinking about facing everyone at school when the whole apartment complex knew exactly what had happened, when their mothers had witnessed the social workers at our door. Walking through the school gates that morning felt like walking through actual fire, whispers following me down every single corridor, eyes tracking my movement, like I had a neon sign on my forehead announcing everything. Some girls physically pressed themselves against the lockers when I passed them, fear making their faces tight and uncomfortable, while others watched with something that might have been hope flickering cautiously in their expressions. How does an entire community keep believing something so obviously painful is protection? I wondered as I walked. The way my aunt calls the social workers government devils while she's literally heating irons to burn children makes me question how traditions get so twisted over time that hurting becomes caring in people's confused minds. During morning assembly, Shanice found me, grabbed my hand tightly, and squeezed it so hard her nails dug into my palm painfully. Her lips barely moved when she whispered urgently that my aunt was organizing a meeting, gathering all the mothers in the building to fight back against the educated people from downtown who didn't understand our community ways. After school ended, I walked out the main entrance to find 4 mothers waiting by the school gate looking angry. Mrs. Patterson standing in front like a military general ready for war. She actually spat on the sidewalk near my feet, her voice intentionally loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear when she announced that I'd brought shame on all of us, teaching these downtown social workers our private community business, putting every girl in danger because now they'd come investigating all our daughters. Before I could even take a step backward, Mrs. Thompson pushed through the crowd of students who'd gathered to watch the confrontation, her professional bag swinging at her side as she planted herself physically between me and the angry mothers. She didn't raise her voice at all, just stood there with her arms crossed professionally, looking at each woman directly in turn before stating clearly that any harassment of a minor under her legal protection would be reported directly to the police station 3 blocks away. Mrs. Patterson's face twisted like she'd bitten into something incredibly sour, but she stepped back reluctantly, pulling the other mothers with her, their angry whispers following us as Mrs. Thompson walked me quickly to her parked car. That evening, while I sat at Mrs. Thompson's small kitchen table working on algebra homework, someone knocked firmly on her apartment door. When she opened it cautiously, my mother stood there holding a covered dish that smelled exactly like my favorite chicken and rice with extra seasoning. She came in quietly, setting the warm dish on the kitchen counter before sitting across from me at the table, her hands shaking slightly as she admitted that my aunt wouldn't speak to her anymore at all, said she'd completely failed as a mother by letting government outsiders interfere with family business. Her voice cracked with emotion when she said it, and I saw her wipe her eyes quickly before standing up to leave. 4 days later at school during lunch period, I was sitting under the big oak tree when 2 younger girls from 6th grade walked up to me nervously, looking around constantly before the smaller one lifted her school shirt just enough to show fresh burns across her chest, the skin still red and damaged. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she whispered desperately, and I didn't know if she meant the physical pain or if people would keep doing this to girls like us forever. That afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez's white van pulled up to our apartment complex again, but this time, 4 more vehicles followed behind, filled with nurses in scrubs, social workers with official clipboards, and 3 police officers who positioned themselves by the building entrance. They had official legal papers, a court order that authorized them to examine all girls under 17, and mothers started frantically grabbing their daughters, trying to hide them in back bedrooms and closets. But the officers made it absolutely clear the law was the law now, no exceptions. One by one, they called the girls into the community room they'd set up with privacy screens, and I could hear crying from inside as nurses documented what they discovered. By the time the sun started setting orange over the buildings, they'd examined 23 girls, and the lead nurse came out with actual tears in her eyes, telling Ms. Rodriguez that some had active infections requiring immediate hospital treatment. Others had permanent tissue damage that might never heal properly, and the youngest girl was only 10 years old. Officials took photographs, wrote everything down in their thick official binders, while mothers wept openly, and grandmothers shouted about tradition being destroyed by educated people from downtown who didn't understand our protective ways. The next morning, the county council called an emergency public meeting in the big hall near the community center, and Mrs. Thompson picked me up early so I could witness what happened when community leaders had to face the truth publicly. The room divided like oil and water, with child protection advocates on one side showing medical slides of burn damage, infection rates, and long-term physical complications, while community elders on the other side argued passionately about culture, protection, and the right way to raise daughters safely. That evening, I was reading a library book at Mrs. Thompson's apartment when I heard scratching at the bedroom window, and there was Shanice climbing through like we used to do at each other's apartments before everything changed so dramatically. She sat on the bed, pulling her knees tight to her chest, and told me her mother wanted to send her away to live with relatives in South Carolina, thinking she'd be safe from the social workers there and their investigations. We held hands in the dark room, both of us knowing what really happened in other communities, how the practice was even more common there, how the pressing happened where no officials ever came to check on girls. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson spread papers and pamphlets across her living room floor, statistics about thousands of girls across multiple states going through the same trauma, and I helped her organize them into presentations for other schools while she explained that education and knowledge were how we fought this practice. I thought about all the girls who didn't have a Mrs. Thompson in their lives, who had no one to show them those papers or tell them their bodies weren't meant to be burned for tradition. At school, the principal called a special assembly about body safety and child protection, but by the time we lined up by grade, I noticed empty spaces everywhere. My homeroom class had shrunk from 36 students to 20 because parents were pulling their daughters out in protest of the education. Education became another casualty of tradition, another price girls paid for being born female in our community. Then, on the 7th day, just as morning classes started, my aunt appeared at the school's main office with 6 elders from our building, all of them dressed in their best clothes, like they were appearing in court, demanding I return home immediately because this was private family business that didn't concern government outsiders. The principal started to waver uncertainly, looking between them and Mrs. Thompson, until she pulled out an official protection order with the state seal stamped in red ink. And I'll never forget my aunt's face when she saw it, like the world she'd always known had just cracked wide open. The building went completely quiet after that, everyone staring at the legal paper like it might catch fire. And the social workers started moving into action, one of them placing her hand protectively on my shoulder, while another stepped physically between me and my aunt, who kept opening and closing her mouth, without any words coming out. They led me to their official van, Mrs. Thompson following close behind, and I watched through the back window as my aunt stood frozen in the office doorway, getting smaller and smaller until we turned the corner out of sight. The next several days blurred together in a confusing mess of medical examinations and photographs and questions asked repeatedly by different people in different government offices, each one writing down my answers in thick folders that got passed from desk to desk. They took more photographs of my scars under bright examination lights, measured them precisely with medical rulers, asked me to rate the pain on numbered scales from 1 to 10, and through it all, Mrs. Thompson sat beside me steadily, her hand on my back, whenever I started shaking with anxiety. On the 8th day, they drove us to the courthouse in downtown Atlanta, a massive building with tall columns that made my stomach flip just looking at it from outside. Inside the halls echoed with footsteps and voices bouncing off polished marble floors. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, with rows of benches like church pews and a raised platform where the judge sat, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, who looked directly at me when I walked in nervously. My legs felt like jelly as they led me to a chair facing her imposing desk, and I could hear my mother somewhere behind me, her breathing sharp and quick, like she'd been running a marathon. The judge asked me to tell her what happened, her voice soft but authoritative, and I started talking, the words coming out jumbled and confused at first, about the heated iron and the stove, and the smell of burning skin that I'd never forget. How they physically held me down, how my aunt said it was for my protection, how it happened twice when my body kept developing naturally. My voice cracked with emotion when I described the pain in detail, how it felt like my whole chest was being crushed and burned simultaneously, how I couldn't sleep for weeks without crying from the pain, and behind me, I heard my mother make a sound like someone had punched her hard in the stomach. The judge wrote everything down carefully, asking gentle clarifying questions when I got confused or mixed up the chronological order of events, never rushing me even when I had to stop to wipe my face. When my testimony was finished, she thanked me sincerely for being brave enough to speak up and said they would make absolutely certain I was safe going forward. Then the bailiff led me out through a side door while my mother stayed behind for her own testimony about what she'd witnessed. I found the women's bathroom down the long hall and splashed cold water on my face, trying desperately to stop my hands from shaking. When the door opened and my mother came in, her face was puffy and red from crying. She looked at me in the mirror for a long moment before the words started spilling out like a dam breaking. How she wanted to protect me, but was too afraid of my aunt, of the family, of what people in the community would say if she went against tradition. And then she was holding me tight, and we were both shaking, her tears soaking into my hair, while we stood there in that courthouse bathroom. The next morning at school felt different somehow, like everyone knew where I'd been the day before. And during lunch period, I noticed a girl from 7th grade had bruises on her arms, purple marks peeking out from under her uniform sleeves. When I asked if she was okay, she pulled away defensively, wrapping her arms around herself, and said bitterly, "Not everyone has a teacher from Boston to save them from their families." Her eyes hard and angry in a way that made my chest feel tight. I wanted to tell her about the protection order, about the judge with kind eyes, but she was already walking away quickly, and I realized with a sinking feeling how many other girls were still waking up to heated irons in their homes. The day after that, Ms. Rodriguez showed up at Lincoln Middle School with a whole medical team, setting up a health screening in the nurse's office that parents legally couldn't object to since it was framed as a general wellness checkup. But we all knew what they were really looking for beneath the surface. One by one, girls went into the nurse's office and came out, some looking relieved, others with faces tight with worry and fear. And by the end of the school day, they'd found 9 more girls with clear signs of pressing, burn scars, and damaged tissue that told the same story as mine. That evening, I was helping Mrs. Thompson prepare spaghetti dinner in her kitchen when we heard the crash. Glass exploding inward as rocks flew through the living room windows, and we dropped to the floor instinctively as more rocks followed, shattering windows one by one. The mothers from the building had formed an angry mob, the message clear as day that we needed to stop interfering immediately or face worse consequences. Mrs. Thompson called 911 with shaking hands while I pressed myself into the corner, trying to make myself invisible. The police arrived fast, their sirens cutting through the night, and suddenly the apartment was full of uniformed officers taking photographs of the damage, collecting the rocks as evidence, asking us over and over if we saw who did it. The next day, they increased police patrols around the apartment and school significantly, police cars circling the block every hour. And the detective, a tall woman with a serious face, took our statements about the attack and said this escalation changed everything, that criminal charges would definitely follow, now that there was violence and intimidation involved. That evening, Mrs. Thompson taught me to make homemade pasta, something she learned during her time studying in Italy, showing me how to test if it was ready by throwing a piece at the wall to see if it stuck. While we cooked together, she talked about how fear was their weapon, but we had something stronger, the law and each other, stirring the pot with steady hands, even though I could see the genuine worry in her eyes about what might happen next. That night, I dreamed about the irons again, not the rocks through the window, but the heated iron pressed against my chest. And I woke up at 4 a.m. soaked in sweat, my heart racing like I'd been running. Mrs. Thompson found me on the balcony, breathing in the cool night air, and without saying anything at all, she made us chamomile tea, and we sat watching the city sleep below us, the streetlights twinkling like stars, both of us knowing some wounds don't show up in photographs or medical reports. 3 days later, a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution showed up with a camera and notebook, walking through our apartment complex, asking questions. And I watched from Mrs. Thompson's window as mothers quickly locked their doors when she passed, pulling their daughters inside. The divide was getting deeper every single day between those who wanted change and those who clung tight to tradition. Neighbors who used to share meals now crossing the street to avoid each other. And that same afternoon, Mrs. Patterson organized a counter meeting at the community center. I heard later that 60 women showed up, filling the room with angry voices calling for the social workers to leave our community alone. Mrs. Patterson preaching from the front that educated outsiders wanted to destroy our culture and turn our daughters into promiscuous girls who would bring shame to their families. But the county child protection director wasn't backing down at all. And 3 days later, she stood in front of news cameras at Children's Healthcare, announcing that every single case of chest pressing in our county would be investigated thoroughly, that all medical workers were now legally required to report any signs of it, and that community leaders who tried to block the investigation would face criminal charges themselves. The community elders went absolutely crazy when they heard this announcement, threatening to organize protests if the government kept attacking our protective customs. And suddenly, what started as me running to a teacher for help became this huge political fight that had everyone in Atlanta taking sides. The next morning, Keisha showed up at Mrs. Thompson's apartment where I was staying. My cousin, looking way older than her 16 years, with dark circles under her eyes and her shoulders hunched forward like she was still trying to hide her body. She sat next to me on the couch and took my hand, squeezing it tight before pulling up her shirt to show me the scars across her chest, thick raised lines that crisscrossed worse than mine because my aunt had pressed her 6 times before giving up. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice shaking as she traced one of the scars with her finger. "Maybe my daughters won't have to hide like we did." We sat there holding each other while she told me how the apartment building had split into 2 camps, some supporting Aunt and others quietly saying, maybe it was time for change, though nobody dared say it too loud where the wrong people might hear. That same week, 4 mothers approached Mrs. Thompson after school, waiting until all the other teachers had left before knocking nervously on her classroom door, their eyes darting around constantly like they were doing something illegal. They wanted help and information, but were terrified of what would happen if their husbands or the community elders found out they were questioning tradition. So Mrs. Thompson started organizing secret meetings at a church basement where mothers could talk about their fears and learn about the law protecting their daughters. I went back to the apartment complex 5 days later with 2 uniformed police officers beside me, needing to get more of my clothes and school supplies, and everything looked smaller somehow, like the place had physically shrunk while I was gone. My aunt stood in her doorway watching us silently, her face like stone, not moving or speaking even when I walked directly past her to get to my room. And the silence felt heavier than any shouting match we'd ever had before. The other kids in the building stared at me like I was a complete stranger, some with open curiosity and others with something that looked like fear, probably because their parents had told them I was trouble now, dangerous to be around. During one of the secret mothers' meetings the following week, everything went terribly wrong when someone's husband burst through the church door, shouting about traitors selling our culture to government outsiders. His face twisted with rage as he pointed at each woman there accusingly. The mothers scattered like startled birds, some running out the back door, while others tried desperately to explain they were just having a prayer meeting. But he kept yelling about how they were destroying everything our ancestors built, and I realized then that change came with a price not everyone could afford to pay, that standing up meant losing something. The second court hearing happened 4 days after that, with the judge ordering comprehensive medical exams for every girl under 18 in our apartment complex. While my aunt's public defender argued about cultural rights and traditional practices that had existed for generations in our community, the judge cut him off sharply, saying culture couldn't be used as a legal excuse to harm children, that safety came before tradition every single time, and that the exams would happen whether the families agreed or not. My mother showed up at Mrs. Thompson's apartment the next evening with my math and science textbooks, staying to help me with algebra homework even though she looked exhausted from fighting with family all day. "They barely speak to me now," she admitted, while we worked through equations, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote. "But seeing you strong like this, maybe it's worth losing them if it means you get to keep yourself whole." We spent 3 hours going through my assignments, both of us pretending this was normal, like we used to do before everything exploded, slowly rebuilding something between us that had been broken by those heated irons. Then Mrs. Thompson got hit with a transfer notice in the mail, ordering her to report to some rural school 180 miles away in South Georgia. Obviously, someone's attempt to get rid of the troublemaker who had started all this by actually listening to a scared girl. She fought it hard, filing official complaints and calling the teachers' union. But the pressure was very real, and I could see the worry in her eyes, even as she promised me she wouldn't leave until this situation was completely finished. I started teaching other girls in our grade level about their legal rights during lunch breaks, showing them the pamphlets Mrs. Thompson had given me, watching as some grabbed them eagerly while others refused to even touch them, scared of what knowing might cost their families. The knowledge spread slowly through whispers and secret conversations in bathroom stalls. But fear moved faster, especially after word got out about the transfer notice and what happened to women who spoke up against tradition. Everything got dramatically worse when Shanice's mother decided to send her away to live with relatives in rural Alabama, keeping the promise she'd made about removing her daughter from the corrupting influence of the educated city people and their dangerous ideas. I watched the Greyhound bus pull away, with my best friend's face pressed against the back window, her eyes wide with fear and betrayal, and I wondered how many other girls would disappear like this, sent away to maintain the silence that kept the irons hot and the tradition alive in the darkness. 4 weeks later, at the county health department downtown, the director stood in front of a conference room packed with nurses and doctors from across Atlanta, explaining the new mandatory reporting requirements that would change everything. Every healthcare worker who found signs of chest pressing had to report it now by law, no exceptions whatsoever. And the intensive training session showed them exactly what to look for: the burn patterns, the tissue damage, the infections that came after. I watched from the hallway through a crack in the door where Mrs. Thompson had brought me to witness history being made, my own scars hidden safely under my school uniform, but burning with the memory of everything. The next morning, my mother showed up at Mrs. Thompson's apartment with an envelope, her hands shaking as she handed it over carefully. And inside was my aunt's handwriting on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The words cut deeper than any heated iron ever could, saying I'd destroyed our family, brought shame on our ancestors, turned my back on everything that protected us for generations in our community. But at the very bottom, in smaller shaky letters, she wrote that she missed me, that the apartment felt empty without my voice and laughter. My mother stood there crying while I read it 3 times slowly, trying to understand how someone could love you and hurt you in the same breath, how tradition could matter more than the pain it caused the people you loved. That afternoon, a teacher from a school in another county called Mrs. Thompson's cell phone, speaking in whispers about girls in her class who desperately needed help, who came to school with bandages hidden under their uniforms, who flinched when anyone got too close to them. The network was growing quietly, teacher to teacher, school to school across Georgia. Each conversation, another crack in the wall of silence that had protected this practice for so long. Mrs. Thompson gave me a journal that night, one with a lock and key, telling me to write everything down, every memory, every detail, because my story could help other girls understand they weren't alone in this. Writing hurt in a different way than the irons had, each word bringing back the smell of burning flesh, the sound of my own screams, the feeling of betrayal when the people who were supposed to protect me held me down instead of protecting me. 5 days into keeping the journal, everything exploded publicly when the journalist who'd been investigating our case published her article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with the headline, "The Community Where Tradition Scars," spread across the entire front page. Our apartment complex's name was right there for everyone in the city to see, along with statistics about how many girls went through this, medical reports about the permanent damage it caused, quotes from doctors calling it torture and child abuse. Within hours, reporters from every news station in Atlanta were calling the health department, wanting interviews, wanting to visit our community, wanting to put faces to the story that was suddenly on everyone's lips across the state. The next morning, a convoy of government vehicles rolled into our apartment complex, dust flying everywhere as officials from the State Department of Children and Family Services stepped out with cameras and official clipboards, saying they needed to see the evidence firsthand, needed to document everything for their statewide investigation. Privacy became something we used to have as reporters, followed the officials taking photographs of our homes, our kitchens, the very irons that had been heated on our stoves. Mrs. Thompson kept me away from the cameras strategically, but I watched from her apartment window as my aunt faced down a state government minister, her chin high with defiance, even as her world crumbled around her. That night, exactly 2 months since I'd run to Mrs. Thompson for help that day after school, I stood in front of her mirror without the compression wraps I'd worn for so long, letting my body exist without apology for the first time in years. The freedom felt strange and scary and wonderful all at once, like learning to breathe again after holding your breath underwater for too long. The investigation kept expanding rapidly as 7 more girls from schools across the county came forward with their own stories, each one different but fundamentally the same. Stories of heated irons and hot skillets and flat pressing boards, all the tools our aunts and grandmothers had turned into weapons against our developing bodies. The health officials worked overtime documenting each case carefully, taking photographs of scars, recording video testimonies, building a mountain of evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away as protective tradition. My mother came to Mrs. Thompson's apartment 3 days later with her face drawn and tired, telling me she'd lost her job at the grocery store because the manager said she brought shame to their business by letting her daughter speak out against community customs. Watching her face as she tried to stay strong for me while her world fell apart was worse than any physical pain I'd endured, knowing that speaking the truth had cost her everything she'd worked for. The community leaders called a press conference the next day, gathering at the main building to denounce the investigation as an attack on our culture by outsiders who didn't understand our protective ways. But then something completely unexpected happened when one elder, an older woman whose granddaughter had nearly died from infection after her 4th pressing, stood up slowly and said, maybe it was time to question traditions that left children permanently scarred and damaged. The crack in their unified front was small, but it was definitely there, visible to everyone. And in that moment, I understood that change wasn't just about laws and investigations, but about people being brave enough to say that love shouldn't require suffering, that protection shouldn't leave scars, that tradition wasn't sacred when it came at the cost of children's bodies and futures. 4 days later, the news showed state legislators arguing about chest pressing on live television. Some said education was enough. Others wanted mandatory jail time for anyone who did it. My mother watched from Mrs. Thompson's tiny living room while I did geometry homework at the kitchen table, trying to focus on angles and proofs. The next morning, Keisha showed up with 2 plastic bags of clothes because my mother couldn't pay rent alone anymore on her reduced income. We squeezed into the single bed that night, her on one side, me on the other, mother in the middle, like when we were little kids, except now we whispered about finding jobs and saving money instead of fairy tales and dreams. Back at the apartment complex, I heard later that traditional healers had arrived from out of state, claiming all the sick girls were being punished for abandoning their culture and disrespecting ancestors. They burned sage and chanted over the apartments where girls had been taken to the hospital. Some mothers started doubting themselves seriously, wondering if maybe they'd brought curses on their daughters by cooperating with the government investigation. When I went back to Lincoln Middle School 3 days later, my desk had been moved to the back corner of every classroom. Kids I'd known since elementary school turned away when I walked past them in hallways. Teachers pretended not to notice when nobody wanted to be my lab partner in science class. At lunch, I sat alone at a table watching groups of students whisper and point at me. One girl said loudly that her mother told her not to talk to me because I was the one who brought shame to our entire community, that I was dangerous. That afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez stood before the County Board of Education with a laptop and projector. The medical photos made board members physically look away from the screen. Infected wounds, surgical scars, tissue damage that would never heal properly, no matter how much time passed. 51 confirmed cases just in our county, she said clearly. 15 requiring immediate surgery, 4 with permanent damage affecting future breastfeeding ability. The evidence was undeniable. but nobody wanted to see it displayed so publicly. The next day, the court ordered my aunt and 13 other women to attend mandatory education sessions about child development and human rights. They had to go every week for 4 months or face contempt of court charges. My aunt's friends said it was pure humiliation being taught like school children about things they'd done for generations to protect girls. Mrs. Thompson got another letter saying her transfer request had been approved, that she'd be sent to a rural school in South Georgia. But after the newspapers picked up the story and parents started protesting outside the school board, the education department reversed the decision completely. She cried that evening while cooking spaghetti again, said it was the first time in weeks she'd felt like maybe things could actually change, that speaking up mattered. My mother found out about a group of women meeting secretly at different locations. They were all mothers who'd refused to press their daughters or who deeply regretted doing it to them. 16 of them now, sharing stories and planning how to protect the younger girls still at risk. They met at night after their husbands were asleep, speaking in whispers about resistance and change and protecting the next generation. I helped my mother fill out job applications at the public library computer, typing while she dictated her work history. Her hands shook less now when signing her name at the bottom. We didn't talk about my aunt or going back to the apartment complex. Some things broke too badly to ever fix completely. Then the devastating news came from the next county over. A 12-year-old girl dead from septic infection after her mother used a heated clothes iron. The funeral turned into a battlefield between those calling it manslaughter and those calling it tradition. The girl's father wanted to press criminal charges, but the elders said it would destroy their entire community if they did. Her mother just sat there crying uncontrollably, holding her daughter's school uniform, saying she only wanted to protect her from boys. The next morning, government vehicles rolled into our apartment complex again, with medical teams wearing white coats and carrying equipment I'd never seen before. They set up official tents near the parking lot and started examining every girl under 19, documenting scars, taking photographs, asking detailed questions about who did what and when. Some mothers tried desperately to hide their daughters in closets, but the officials had lists from the schools, knew exactly who to look for. The nurses were gentle but thorough, measuring the damage carefully, categorizing it by severity 1 through 5, with 5 being the worst cases requiring immediate hospital treatment. They found 4 girls with active infections who got loaded into ambulances right away, their mothers crying and trying to climb in after them, but being held back firmly by security officers. The lead doctor kept shaking his head as he filled out official forms, muttering about how many cases they were finding, how the state government couldn't ignore this anymore, how this needed to stop immediately. 3 days later, Mrs. Thompson asked me to speak at the school assembly about body safety and child protection. Said my voice could help other girls understand their rights under the law. My hands shook uncontrollably as I stood in front of 250 students, but I told them about the irons, about the unbearable pain, about how tradition wasn't always right just because it was old or had been done for generations. I explained what the health officials taught us about infections and permanent damage, how some women couldn't breastfeed their babies later because of what was done to them as girls trying to protect them. When I finished speaking, the auditorium was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Then 4 girls stayed behind after everyone filed out, pulling me aside near the water fountain to whisper their own stories, showing me scars hidden under their school uniforms, asking desperately if the medical teams could help them too, if it was too late. The next afternoon, my aunt got summoned officially to attend an education session at the community center, part of her agreement to avoid criminal prosecution. She sat in the back row with her arms crossed defensively, glaring at the health educator, who patiently explained with medical diagrams how breast tissue actually developed, what damage the pressing caused, why it didn't actually prevent anything it claimed to prevent. The educator showed statistics from other regions where the practice had stopped, how teen pregnancy rates stayed the same or even dropped when girls got proper education instead of torture. I watched my aunt's face shift from anger to confusion to something that might have been doubt, though she'd never admitted out loud. Later that week, Mrs. Thompson kept me after class and spread university brochures across her desk, pointing at programs for pre-law, pre-med, social work, public health, saying this fight needed educated women who understood both worlds, who could speak to both the elders and the government effectively. She helped me fill out scholarship applications, explaining standardized tests and entrance exams, showing me a future I'd never imagined possible before, where I could leave the community but come back with power to create real lasting change. The university brochures spreading across that desk made my chest tight with both fear and hope. Did Mrs. Thompson plan this all along from the first day? Did she see potential in her student from the very beginning? Or was she just responding to what happened? The thought made me realize how one person believing in you could change everything. Then the male community leaders called an emergency meeting with the health officials, demanding that women's issues be handled by women only, that men from downtown had no business interfering in their family traditions. Ms. Rodriguez stood her ground in the packed meeting hall, reminding them firmly that children's rights transcended gender boundaries, that the law didn't care about their comfort when girls were dying from infections. One elder pounded his cane and stormed out dramatically, but others stayed, listening carefully as she explained the new state laws being drafted, the mandatory penalties for anyone who continued the practice after being officially warned. The hospitals started using a special code for pressing injuries, making it easier to track cases statewide and mandatory for doctors to report them, just like any other child abuse. Official forms got distributed to every clinic with clear instructions, photographs showing what to look for, phone numbers to call immediately. Within days, reports started flooding in from rural counties, where girls had been suffering in silence, afraid to seek help before now. Each report meant another investigation, another family questioned, another tradition challenged by law and science and medical evidence. My mother surprised us all by getting a job at a restaurant owned by Mrs. Thompson's college friend, her first real steady income that didn't depend on my father or the extended family. She came home that first day with a small smile, counting her tips at the kitchen table, talking about saving for my college application fees, maybe even getting her own apartment. It wasn't much money, but it was hers earned honestly, and I saw her stand a little straighter when she walked through the complex, no longer afraid of judgment. But not everyone supported the changes happening, and soon local shops started refusing service to families who cooperated with the health officials, calling us traitors and government puppets. The woman who sold vegetables at the corner store turned her back when my mother approached. The man at the convenience store said his supplies were finished whenever we came near. But others quietly slipped us extra portions when no one was watching, whispering that they agreed with us, but couldn't say so publicly where their families might hear. Every purchase became a political statement, every transaction a choice between tradition and progress. A letter arrived from Shanice, smuggled out through a cousin who traveled between states. She wrote in pencil on torn notebook paper about missing school desperately, about other girls in her Alabama town still facing the irons, about how her mother kept her inside now, afraid the social workers would come for them if anyone found out. She asked if the changes would ever reach her town, if she'd ever see a classroom again, if I could help her somehow. And I folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing pile of evidence Mrs. Thompson was collecting for a larger lawsuit. Then came the community meeting that changed absolutely everything, when Mrs. Patterson's own daughter stood up in the packed hall and slowly lifted her shirt, revealing scars that crisscrossed her chest like a map of pain and trauma. She'd been pressed 8 times between ages 11 and 16, each time more brutal than the last, until there was barely any normal tissue left at all. Mrs. Patterson's face crumbled as her daughter spoke about the infections, the fever dreams, the nights she thought she'd die while her mother held the hot iron, believing she was protecting her. And suddenly, the divide between tradition and protection became impossible to ignore or deny. 4 weeks later, I sat in the crowded courthouse, watching the judge shuffle through papers, while my aunt's public defender argued that tradition wasn't abuse, that this was cultural practice going back generations. The courtroom was packed with women from our complex, some supporting us, others glaring like we'd betrayed everything they stood for. Ms. Rodriguez presented comprehensive medical reports, photographs of scars, testimonies from adult women who couldn't breastfeed their babies years later because of the damage. The judge kept adjusting her glasses, looking between the evidence and my aunt, who sat straight-backed in her best Sunday dress. When she finally spoke, her voice carried through the silent room firmly. "Child abuse," she said clearly. "This practice constitutes child abuse under Georgia state law. There is no cultural exception." My aunt's lawyer jumped up immediately, papers already prepared for appeal, but something had shifted permanently in that room. The next morning, Keisha enrolled in a nursing program at the community college downtown. She spread her textbooks across our shared bedroom floor, studying anatomy and physiology, with new highlighters that caught the light. We studied together in the evenings, her memorizing medical terms while I worked through calculus problems, both of us building futures our scars couldn't touch or limit. The radio stations picked up the story, and suddenly everyone in Atlanta had opinions. I heard our case discussed on 4 different programs while walking to school, callers arguing about tradition versus child protection. Some women calling in to share their own stories of being pressed 6, 7, 8 times as girls, speaking publicly for the first time in their lives. The Children's Hospital started group therapy sessions specifically for survivors, and my mother signed me up without asking permission first. I sat in a circle with 10 other girls, none of us talking much at first, just existing in the same space with our shared understanding. The therapist, a woman from Nigeria, with gentle hands and kind eyes, didn't push us to speak before we were ready. Sometimes we drew pictures instead of talking. Sometimes we just sat together. One girl showed us keloid scars that covered her entire chest. Another couldn't stop scratching at phantom pains that never went away. Mrs. Thompson found a note slipped under her apartment door one morning, the writing angry and slanted. "Stop corrupting our daughters," it said threateningly. "Stop destroying our culture, or you'll be sorry." She showed it to the police, who increased patrols significantly near her building, but we all knew threats didn't always come with warnings. Sometimes they came silently in the dark. She started varying her route to school, checking under her car before getting in, looking over her shoulder constantly. The fear sat heavy on all of us, like a weight we couldn't put down. The State Department of Children and Family Services announced new funding for survivor support programs at a press conference I watched on the school library computer. They promised free counseling services, medical treatment for complications, educational scholarships for girls who'd missed school during recovery. Money moved slowly through government bureaucracy, but at least it was moving in the right direction. 3 months had passed since the social workers first came to our apartment complex, and I found myself measuring everything as before and after pressing. Before, when I hunched my shoulders and wore oversized hoodies everywhere. After, when I could stand straight without fear of judgment. Before, when silence protected tradition at the cost of our bodies. After, when speaking became survival and resistance. Time felt different now, each day of freedom worth a month of the old life. At school, younger girls from 6th and 7th grade started approaching me with questions during lunch and after class. "Why do they do it?" they asked anxiously. "Does it really prevent pregnancy like our mothers say it does?" I answered carefully, remembering Mrs. Thompson's words about education replacing mythology and fear. One girl, maybe 11 years old, whispered that her mother was planning to press her during spring break. I gave her the phone numbers, told her about the law, watched hope and fear battle in her young eyes as she tucked the paper in her pocket. My mother saw my aunt at the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon, both reaching for the same package of chicken. They didn't speak at all, but my mother said they nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. Families break in big dramatic moments and heal in small quiet ones, she told me later, while cooking that same chicken for dinner. And maybe that's all we can ask for right now. The announcement came over the radio during morning announcements at school, a statewide conference on harmful traditional practices with our case as a primary example for other communities. Suddenly, reporters wanted exclusive interviews. Nonprofit organizations wanted us to speak at their events, Everyone wanted to make us symbols of change and progress. The weight of representing more than just ourselves pressed down heavy, but this time, we could choose whether to carry it or not. Legal aid lawyers started showing up at the complex the next week, setting up makeshift offices under the parking lot, awning with folding tables and boxes of paperwork. They took detailed statements from every girl who wanted to speak, writing everything down in careful handwriting while mothers stood behind their daughters, with protective hands on their shoulders. The lawyers worked for free, said justice shouldn't cost money that poor families didn't have, and more families started coming forward each day as word spread. I spent hours helping them organize files alphabetically, translating between English and some families' native languages when needed, watching as the stack of cases grew taller and taller on the folding tables. Mrs. Thompson asked if I wanted to help train other girls to speak in their communities safely, and my hands shook when I said yes, but my voice stayed steady and strong. We practiced in her living room, me standing in front of 6 other girls from different apartment complexes across Atlanta, teaching them the words I'd learned about rights and laws and bodies that belong to us alone. The community members who wanted change called a meeting without the traditionalists, just the families ready for progress, and 19 households showed up with their daughters. They drafted a letter to the county board supporting the statewide ban, signing their names one by one, while the older women watched from their doorways, some nodding approval, others shaking their heads in disapproval. I went back to visit the complex clinic where the nurse now checked girls quietly during regular wellness visits, looking for signs of harm, documenting everything carefully in her confidential records. She smiled at me when I walked in for my own checkup. This woman who'd been there all along, but only now could act on what she'd been seeing for years. The radio crackled with news that made everyone stop what they were doing to listen. The Georgia State Legislature was voting on the chest-pressing ban that afternoon in the Capitol building. We crowded around the old radio in Mrs. Thompson's living room, listening as they announced each vote, and when it passed by just 9 votes, some people cheered while others turned away, angry and defeated. The law changed officially, but hearts took much longer to transform. Implementation guidelines came out the very next day, focusing on education before prosecution, giving communities 1 full year to comply, trying to balance justice with understanding and cultural sensitivity. My aunt showed up at Mrs. Thompson's apartment 4 days later, sitting stiff in the plastic chair by the window, not looking at me directly while she sipped the tea we offered her. "The world changes too fast," she said quietly, but she came anyway, and that meant something significant. Training sessions for community women started that week in the recreation center, some dragging their feet reluctantly, others rushing to get front-row seats. The health workers explained the damage patiently with diagrams and statistics, showed medical photographs that made people gasp, answered questions honestly, and slowly knowledge spread through whispers and conversations over kitchen tables. Ms. Rodriguez held a press conference announcing that prosecution would proceed for only the most severe cases where girls had nearly died, 4 women already facing criminal charges. But my aunt wasn't among them because she'd cooperated fully with the investigation from the beginning. The final custody hearing was set for the following Monday, where the judge would decide on permanent custody and protection orders going forward, and my mother held my hand so tight it hurt as we sat in the courthouse waiting room going over what would happen. The judge was the same woman with gray hair who looked at me like she actually saw me as a person, not just another case file in her heavy docket. And when she asked if I felt safe returning to live near the complex, I nodded yes, because my mother had already moved us to a different building where the women who supported us lived. The ruling came down clear and firm. My mother got full legal custody. Regular health checks would happen every single month at the county clinic, and my aunt couldn't be alone with me unsupervised. But they didn't cut her off completely because the judge said families need time to heal from trauma. Walking out of that courthouse felt like floating on air. My mother crying happy tears, while Mrs. Thompson squeezed my shoulder proudly, and cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. The next day, we started packing up the small room I'd been staying in at Mrs. Thompson's apartment for 3 months. She pressed books into my hands, old textbooks she'd used at Boston University, notebooks filled with her neat handwriting about women's rights and public health education. And when she said I'd started something bigger than any of us, I felt the weight of those words settle into my chest, like a promise I'd have to keep. The drive to our new apartment took forever, my stomach doing flips as we passed familiar streets and landmarks. And when we pulled up, some neighbors came out to greet us warmly, while others turned their backs and went inside their apartments. Our new place was smaller, just 2 bedrooms instead of 3, but my mother had already installed new locks on both doors and painted the walls bright yellow like sunshine breaking through clouds. And that first night, I barely slept at all, jumping at every sound until Keisha crawled into my bed and held my hand without saying anything, just being there. Morning came with its own rhythm and routine, getting dressed for school without hiding my body under layers, walking to class with my head up proudly, staying after for the new advocacy group Mrs. Thompson had helped start officially, where we learned about our legal rights and how to share them safely with others. Girls started finding me during lunch period, pulling me aside behind the gym to whisper questions anxiously, and I'd slip them Mrs. Thompson's phone number, written on tiny folded pieces of paper, telling them about the law, about protection services, about choices their grandmothers never had, but they did now. My mother turned our living room into a small tailoring business, her old sewing machine humming from early morning to late evening, and women would come for alterations but stay for coffee, their voices dropping low as they asked about what happened to us, about their own daughters, about tradition versus safety and health. 4 days after we'd settled into the new place, I saw my aunt at the corner store buying bread, and we both froze completely until she walked over slowly and said quietly, I looked healthy and strong. Not an apology exactly, but something close to acknowledgement. And I nodded before walking away, because some bridges take years to rebuild properly, if they can be rebuilt at all. Mrs. Thompson visited every week with more advanced books, sitting at our kitchen table, going over algebra problems and college essay writing, telling me that next year I'd be ready for university entrance exams if I kept working this hard consistently. Education becoming my new armor against anyone who thought they could control my future or limit my potential. The support group met in the church basement every Tuesday evening, 10 of us now ranging from 13 to 20 years old. And even though I was one of the youngest, I was the only one whose case had gone completely public, had changed laws and policies. So when it was my turn to share each week, I talked about the burning and the healing and the fighting and the winning, watching their faces transform from fear to something like hope and possibility. My scars were still there, raised lines across my chest that ached when the weather changed. But the shame had burned away in that courtroom, replaced by purpose that filled me up every time another girl took that slip of paper with the phone number, every time my mother's clients left with more than just hemmed pants, every time I opened those university prep books and saw a future where our daughters would never know our pain, would never have to choose between their bodies and their education, would never learn that protection sometimes comes disguised as torture and harm. And as I sat there in that circle of survivors every Tuesday, I knew we weren't just healing ourselves personally, but breaking a chain that had held too many girls captive for too many generations, creating change that would ripple outward, touching lives we'd never meet, protecting daughters not yet born, building a different world where love doesn't require suffering, where tradition adapts to protect children instead of harming them, where every girl's body belongs to her alone. The months that followed became a blur of meetings and testimonies and late-night study sessions at the kitchen table. Mrs. Thompson connected me with a lawyer from the Southern Poverty Law Center who wanted to use our case to challenge similar practices in other immigrant communities across the Southeast. She was a woman named Jennifer Martinez, originally from Texas, with sharp eyes and a briefcase full of legal precedents that she spread across our small kitchen table one evening in October. We spent 3 hours going through everything that had happened, her recording every detail on her laptop while my mother made coffee and listened from the living room. Jennifer explained that our case could set precedent for federal protection, that what happened in our apartment complex was happening in pockets of communities from Florida to Virginia, girls suffering in silence because no one knew it was happening, or no one wanted to see it. She showed us statistics that made my stomach turn, estimates suggesting thousands of girls across the country going through similar trauma, hidden behind closed doors, and cultural traditions that protected the practice. The numbers felt overwhelming, like we'd only touched the surface of something much deeper and darker. That weekend, Mrs. Thompson took me to speak at a conference for social workers and teachers in downtown Atlanta. Standing in front of 200 professionals felt different than talking to my classmates. These were adults who had the power to actually change things, to watch for signs, to intervene before it was too late. My voice shook at first when I started speaking, but then I looked out at their faces and saw them really listening, taking notes, asking questions that showed they cared. One teacher from Savannah stayed after to tell me she'd suspected something similar was happening at her school, but didn't know what to do about it, didn't know it was even possible to intervene. Now she did. The media attention kept growing in waves that never seemed to stop. National news picked up our story, and suddenly I was doing phone interviews with reporters from New York and California, explaining over and over what the pressing was, why families did it, what the physical and emotional damage looked like years later. Some people on social media said I was attacking immigrant communities, that I didn't understand cultural sensitivity. Others called me brave. The comment section became a battlefield I learned to avoid completely for my own mental health. At school, something unexpected started happening in November. Girls who'd previously avoided me started sitting at my lunch table again, not saying much at first, just being present. Then, one by one, they started sharing their own stories, not about pressing necessarily, but about other ways their bodies had been controlled, criticized, restricted by family expectations and cultural norms. We formed an unofficial support group during lunch period, 10 of us by Thanksgiving, talking about everything from strict dress codes to arranged marriages to beauty standards that made us hate our natural features. Mrs. Thompson gave us her classroom during lunch twice a week, and slowly it became a safe space where girls could just exist without judgment. My mother's tailoring business grew steadily as word spread among women in the community who supported the changes. She was making enough money by December to start saving seriously, talking about maybe getting a 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood with good schools. I watched her transform over those months, standing taller, speaking up more, making decisions about our lives without asking permission from anyone. She started taking a business class at the community college on Saturday mornings, coming home with notebooks full of ideas about marketing and pricing and customer service. Keisha got accepted into a nursing program at Georgia State University with a full scholarship specifically for survivors of abuse. When the letter came in the mail, she cried for an hour straight, clutching the acceptance packet like it might disappear if she let go. We celebrated at a small restaurant downtown, just the 3 of us, toasting with sweet tea and talking about the future with an excitement that felt brand new. She moved into the dorms in January, calling me almost every night during those first weeks to share everything she was learning about anatomy and patient care and the science behind healing. The legal case against the 4 women facing criminal charges moved slowly through the court system. Jennifer kept me updated on the progress, explaining how precedent worked, how these cases could change laws not just in Georgia, but potentially nationwide. The trial wasn't scheduled until spring, which meant months of waiting and wondering, and preparing to potentially testify again if needed. The thought made my anxiety spike, but Jennifer assured me I wouldn't be alone, that she'd be there every step, that my voice mattered in ways I probably couldn't fully understand yet. In February, the state legislature passed additional funding for cultural competency training for all healthcare workers and teachers, specifically focused on recognizing and reporting harmful traditional practices. Mrs. Thompson became a trainer for the program, traveling to schools across Georgia to educate staff about the signs to watch for. She'd come home exhausted but energized, telling me about teachers who'd approached her after sessions to report suspicions they'd had for years but didn't know how to address. Each report meant another investigation, another girl potentially saved from what I'd been through. My relationship with my aunt remained complicated and distant. We saw each other occasionally at family gatherings that my mother insisted we still attend, sitting on opposite sides of the room, exchanging polite greetings, but nothing more. She was attending her mandatory education sessions, and I heard through my mother that something was shifting in her understanding, that the medical information was challenging beliefs she'd held her entire life. But changing deeply ingrained beliefs takes time, sometimes years, and I wasn't holding my breath for a dramatic reconciliation that might never come. Shanice came back to Atlanta in March, her mother having finally agreed to let her return after seeing the changes happening in our community. We met at the park near our old apartment complex, sitting on the swings like we used to do as kids, talking for hours about everything that had happened while we were apart. She told me about girls in Alabama who were still suffering, who needed help but didn't know where to turn. We spent that afternoon brainstorming ways to extend the network of support beyond Georgia, reaching girls in rural communities where the practice was even more hidden and accepted. The support group at church had grown to 15 regular members by spring, and we started planning a youth conference for survivors and allies. Mrs. Thompson helped us apply for grant funding, and we spent weeks organizing workshops on healing, advocacy, legal rights, and education. The conference happened on a Saturday in April, with over 60 people showing up from across the state. Seeing that room full of girls and women and supportive adults who believed in change made something crack open in my chest. This realization that we'd built something real and lasting, a community of survivors who refused to stay silent. I got my SAT scores back in May, higher than I'd dared to hope for, high enough for the universities Mrs. Thompson had been researching with me. We celebrated by going to her favorite bookstore downtown, where she bought me a stack of books about women who'd changed the world through activism and education. That night, I sat on my bed reading about Rosa Parks and Malala Yousafzai and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, women who'd refused to accept the world as it was and fought to make it better. I realized I was part of that lineage now, part of a long history of women saying enough is enough. The trial finally happened in late May, a week before school ended for the summer. I testified for 2 hours, answering questions from the prosecutor and the defense attorney, reliving every detail of what happened while my aunt sat in the courtroom but wouldn't look at me directly. The defense tried to argue cultural tradition, tried to paint the women as loving mothers doing what they thought was right. But the medical evidence was overwhelming, the photographs undeniable, the testimony from multiple girls consistent and heartbreaking. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts for all 4 women, with sentences ranging from probation to 3 years in prison, depending on the severity of the cases. Walking out of that courthouse after the verdict felt different than the first time. Then I'd felt relief and fear mixed together. Now I felt something closer to peace, or maybe just the beginning of it. Justice didn't erase what happened, didn't heal the scars completely, didn't undo the trauma. But it validated that what we'd experienced was wrong, that society recognized the harm, that change was possible even when it felt impossible. Summer brought new opportunities and challenges. I got accepted into a pre-law summer program at Emory University, spending 6 weeks on campus learning about constitutional law and civil rights and how to build legal arguments for social change. The other students in the program came from all over the country, many of them activists in their own communities fighting different battles. We bonded quickly over shared experiences of speaking up, of being called troublemakers, of believing that young people could change the world if adults would listen. Mrs. Thompson moved to a new apartment in August, closer to her school, and we helped her pack and unpack boxes on a sweltering Saturday. She gave me keys to her new place, said I always had somewhere safe to go if I needed it. That gesture meant more than she probably realized. This adult who'd chosen to stand with me when it would have been easier to look away, who'd risked her career and safety because she believed protecting children mattered more than maintaining comfortable silence. My mother and I moved to a bigger apartment in September, right before my junior year started. 2 bedrooms in a quiet complex across town, away from all the memories and complicated history. My bedroom had big windows that let in morning light, and I decorated the walls with college pennants and quotes about justice and courage. Starting at a new school felt overwhelming at first, but also liberating. Nobody knew my story unless I chose to share it. I could be just a regular student focused on grades and college applications and normal teenage concerns. But I quickly realized I didn't want to be invisible anymore, didn't want to pretend none of it happened. So when my new English teacher assigned a personal essay, I wrote about the pressing, about speaking up, about how silence protects abusers while truth protects future victims. She asked if she could share it with the class, and I said yes. Reading it aloud to 30 strangers felt terrifying, but when I finished, the room was silent for a long moment before 3 girls approached me after class to share their own stories of harm they'd experienced and never reported. The advocacy work continued and expanded throughout my junior year. Jennifer connected me with a congressional aide who was drafting federal legislation to protect children from harmful traditional practices, and I spent hours on the phone providing input on language and implementation. The bill had a long way to go before it might become law, but being part of that process, knowing my experience was informing policy that could protect thousands of girls, made every difficult moment feel worth it. Keisha finished her first year of nursing school with honors, already talking about specializing in pediatric care, about being the kind of nurse who noticed signs of abuse and actually did something about it. She volunteered at a free clinic on weekends, working with immigrant families, building trust in communities where distrust of medical professionals ran deep because of experiences like ours. Her dream was to open a community health center someday that specifically served survivors, where girls could get treatment without fear of judgment or deportation or family consequences. The support group at church became officially recognized as a nonprofit organization in January of my junior year, with Mrs. Thompson as the faculty advisor and me as the youth director. We got a small grant to create educational materials, hire a part-time counselor, and expand our outreach to other schools. By spring, we had chapters starting in 3 other Georgia counties, each one led by a survivor who'd found the courage to speak up and create change in her own community. My relationship with my aunt remained distant but slowly thawing. She completed her mandatory education program and wrote me a letter that my mother delivered one afternoon. In it, she didn't exactly apologize, but she acknowledged that she'd hurt me, that she'd done what she thought was right but had been wrong, that she was trying to learn and change. It wasn't the apology I'd hoped for, but it was something. I wrote back, a short note saying I appreciated her honesty, that healing takes time for everyone. We started having coffee once a month at a neutral location, awkward conversations where we carefully avoided certain topics, but slowly rebuilt some kind of relationship. The media attention continued in waves, with new stories about our case appearing whenever similar situations were discovered in other communities. Each time, my phone would blow up with interview requests, and I'd have to decide whether to engage or protect my privacy and mental health. Mrs. Thompson taught me that it was okay to say no, that I didn't owe anyone my story, that healing wasn't a performance for public consumption. I learned to be selective, choosing interviews that might actually create change while declining requests that felt exploitative or sensational. Senior year brought college applications and scholarship essays and decisions about the future. I applied to 15 schools, focusing on programs with strong pre-law tracks and reputations for social justice work. Mrs. Thompson helped me craft essays that told my story authentically while highlighting my resilience and leadership. Several schools invited me for interviews, flying me out to visit campuses and meet with admissions counselors who were impressed by my advocacy work and academic achievements despite everything. The acceptance letters started arriving in March, thick envelopes from universities I'd barely dared to dream about. Stanford with a full scholarship, Columbia with a spot in their human rights program, Georgetown offering a place in their prestigious law school pipeline. Each letter felt surreal, like I was reading about someone else's life, not mine. Mrs. Thompson cried when I showed her the Stanford letter, saying she'd always known I was capable of amazing things, that surviving trauma and fighting for change proved strength most people would never have to demonstrate. I chose Stanford, drawn by their commitment to public interest law and their strong alumni network of activists and advocates. The decision meant leaving Georgia, leaving my mother and Keisha and Mrs. Thompson and the community I'd helped build. But it also meant stepping into a future I'd created for myself, using education as a tool for even broader change. My mother threw me a graduation party in June, inviting everyone who'd supported us through the hardest years, a celebration of not just my diploma, but of collective courage and resilience. Standing at graduation in my cap and gown, giving the student speech I'd been selected to deliver, I looked out at the crowd and saw so many faces that represented the journey. My mother crying in the front row, Keisha home from nursing school for the ceremony, Mrs. Thompson beaming with pride. Even my aunt had come, sitting in the back but present, another small step in her own healing journey. I spoke about courage, about speaking truth to power, about how change starts with one person deciding enough is enough, about how we're all responsible for protecting the vulnerable and creating a world where every child can grow up safe and whole. The support group had grown to 12 chapters across 3 states by the time I left for California in August. We'd helped over 200 girls access resources, documented hundreds of cases, influenced policy at local and state levels, and created a network of survivors who refused to be silenced. The work would continue without me at the center, had grown beyond any one person's story to become a movement. That was the whole point, not to be a hero or a savior, but to spark something that would outlive and outgrow my individual contribution. Moving into my Stanford dorm felt like stepping into a new universe, surrounded by brilliant students from around the world, all passionate about different causes and changes they wanted to create. I joined student organizations focused on human rights and child protection, sharing my story with new audiences who'd never heard of breast ironing or chest pressing. The conversations were difficult but necessary, educating people about harmful practices that persist in the shadows, hidden by shame and cultural sensitivity, concerns that prioritize tradition over children's well-being. My mother called every Sunday evening, updating me on life in Atlanta, on the continued growth of her business, on changes happening in our old community. More families were speaking up, more girls were being protected, more women were questioning practices they'd accepted for generations. The change was slow but steady, exactly the kind of cultural shift that took years to fully materialize. She sounded proud when she talked about it, proud of what we'd started together, proud of the daughter who'd found her voice and used it to protect others. And sitting in my dorm room overlooking the California campus, studying constitutional law and civil rights history, I felt that same pride mixed with determination. The scars on my chest would always be there, physical reminders of what I'd survived, but they no longer defined me or limited my future. I was a survivor, yes, but also a student, an advocate, a daughter, a friend, someone building a life defined by purpose rather than trauma, by hope rather than fear, by the belief that speaking up always matters, that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, that tradition must evolve to honor our humanity rather than harm it, and that every girl everywhere deserves to grow up knowing her body belongs to her alone, that love never requires suffering, and that the people meant to protect her should never be the ones who hurt her.